The Canon R5 mirrorless camera, with its image stabilisation, does allow handheld exposures at speeds we wouldn't have thought possible just a few years ago. So here I am at a place called Shelley Beach on the Sunshine Coast of Australia. Now I was with a friend, but I never took a tripod. To be honest, I didn't expect to be photographing a sunset that day. At this point, I think it's worth mentioning that I'm of a certain age where my stability on 2 feet is not the best it's ever been. I think many of you listening would be much steadier than me, pretty sure of that. While waiting for the sunset to develop, I tried a few experiments to capture moving water handheld. Now, full disclosure here, there were some failures in my images. I don't want you to think that every button press resulted in a sharp image. Now I estimate about 3/4, maybe 2/3 of the images I shot were sharp. But from that failure rate, I think we can draw the conclusion that if we set out to take movement pictures, it would be foolish to leave the tripod behind. But of course, when we do find ourselves in a situation we didn't expect to be in, then it's nice to know that we can get a result, handheld, even with slow shutter speeds. Now the sharpness we get is going to depend on our circumstances, the lens that we're using. But if we can sit on a rock or even the ground and steady ourselves, our body is much more stable. If we can brace against a tree or anything that gives us more stability, then our success rate is going to be increased. But if we're standing on slippery rocks where we need to keep an eye on that 7th wave, just in case, then we may not be quite so stable. The first 2 images I showed were shot with the 70 to 200mm zoom. But I switched to the 24-105 for a little while, but here we're using a fabulous lens, 15 to 35mm. Here it was set to 25mm. So why was 25mm the choice here and not 15? Well, it's simply because I used the zoom to create a near perfect composition, because that's quite important here. Now I think this is my favourite shot of that evening because I like the way the water is just nicely moving onto the rocks, not too much, not too little. And I did use the 15mm lens to its full width. Using f/16 of course with aperture priority to take the exposure down to 1/8 of a second. This 15 to 35mm RF lens for the mirrorless camera is great for landscapes and seascapes, as was my previous EF lens, 16 to 35mm. That was much the same. They're perfect for the job and they help us to create great depth in our images. Here, f/22 enabled me to take the shutter speed down to 1/5 of a second, but we still have a good sharp shot, and that little bit of water movement is quite important. This image was taken at a different location to the others, but it was taken at a similar time of day. So when we look at that 1/5 of a second shutter speed, it is very similar to the previous images that I showed. The amount of movement we get in the water will depend on its speed in relation to us. Here it appears faster and more blurred the closer it gets to us. With this shot, things are very much the same at 1/3 of a second shutter speed. So it's been quite an interesting exercise to see how the stabilisation of the Canon R5 and its lenses would impact slow handheld shutter speeds. So I suppose it's nice to know that this is possible, but as I said earlier, if it was our intention to create water movement, then we should have the tripod with us. Now I'm never content to accept hit and miss photography, and hand holding at these speeds there's going to be some misses. And the misses always seem to be on the best wave shots. Have you noticed that? I'll see you next time.